Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's event, How Digital Culture is Shaping the Future of Organizations. This is going to be a conversation on the opportunities and challenges that are facing digitally born organizations. My name is Pedro Arellano, and I'm a director of product management for the Looker product at Google Cloud. And I have the pleasure of being your host and moderator for today's conversation. And I also have the pleasure of being joined by Brad Strauch, who is the former global CIO at PayPal. And he's going to share his perspective on the way that digital acceleration is transforming organizations, both from a cultural perspective as well as a technological perspective. Now, we're just about to get started, but let me go over a few quick housekeeping items first. We're going to have time for Q&A at the end of the session, but we do want to invite you to participate and be part of this conversation as it happens live. So we've done a couple of things for you to participate. First of all, you can send us your questions by typing them in the Q&A box in the webinar window. And we've also enabled group chat for the event. You can find the group chat icon at the bottom toolbar of your webinar screen. We're going to be monitoring the group chat, so we encourage you to participate that way too during the conversation. Let's give it a try right now as I'm talking. Please use the group chat to let us know where you're joining us from, and that way, you can start being part of the conversation right away. We are recording this presentation. We're going to send out a copy of the recording after it's over. And finally, you're going to see a lot of windows on your screen right now. All these windows are customizable. You can move them around. You can minimize them. You can maximize them. If you accidentally minimize or close one of the windows, don't worry about it. Just click the toolbar menu at the bottom, and you can bring it back up. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. And I see people from California and Long Island, New York. Thank you so much for joining us. So let me start by introducing our guest, Brad Strauch, who is the former global CIO at PayPal. Brad has over 30 years of experience in helping companies grow through disruptive technologies and digital transformation. He currently serves as an independent director of Elevate Credit, as well as Hinga, which is a nonprofit that provides microloans in Africa. Brad is a frequent speaker at both business and technology conferences. He has authored numerous articles on innovation, and he is a co-inventor on several U.S. patents. And he received his master's degree in finance from the Krannert School of Management at Purdue University, and also has a bachelor's in mechanical engineering from Purdue. So, Brad, welcome, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, thank you, Pedro. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, pleasure's ours. So, Brad, just gave a quick introduction, but why don't you tell us a little bit more about you and your experience?
Yeah, so my career journey is maybe a little bit different than many in technology, in that, while I did get an undergraduate engineering degree, I really was focused on business and finance, the first part of my first half of my career, for maybe first third. And but I always had this passion for technology. And so over time, I really kind of steered my career more towards tech. And that left me in a place where maybe if I'd taken a different path in my career, I might have ended up as a CFO, which is really weird. And my team hated that, but the kind of questions I asked, but it was actually has been really useful for me. And I love technology, and especially how it relates to business models of companies. So, and I know we'll talk about that a little bit today, but I had the privilege of being at a number of different companies, including at PayPal from 2011 till the beginning of 2019. And so was able to be there when it was part of eBay, when we did the split, and then the IPO in 2015, and as we scaled the company. So happy to chat about those kinds of dimensions of my career and thoughts about that. So looking forward to the discussion today.
Likewise, Brad. It's really interesting. You mentioned that sort of CFO path. In my experience, I've worked with a number of CFOs who have later become CIOs or vice versa. I've also worked with CIOs who come from a technology background and later become CFOs. And I find it very interesting because intuitively, you would think of those two as completely opposite fields, and yet there's a very, very clear link there. Why do you think that is?
Yeah, it is interesting. So, I believe the language of business is finance. And so if you want to be conversant in business, you really have to have a working knowledge of finance. It's very helpful to be able to read financial statements and understand that language. And it's technical. So, it is unusual, I think, maybe to put those things together, but maybe, as you pointed out, not as unusual as it should be. And I think it's a powerful combination. So that's been my experience.
Yep. Great. So we're here to talk about, digitally born organizations and digital acceleration. And you mentioned your experience, your 10 years or so at PayPal. So let's start with the basics. How do you define a company as digital natives? What are the unique attributes and challenges that you think define a company that's a digital native?
Yeah. So that term digital native and digital transformation and terms like that would get used a lot. And I think in several different contexts. I like to think about this idea of digital native I like to start with the business model. So we tend to focus on the tech stack and those kind of things. Those are important. But I think for me, the definition needs to start with, is the business model enabled by technology, by a digital paradigm? And that was the case with PayPal, certainly, and it's the case with a number of other companies. But, I think that rather than saying, well, is the tech stack modern, we should start with, how does the company compete? Is the business model a digital model? Has it been transformed by digital? Was it from the very beginning digital? So that's how I would start to define the digital native piece. And then from there, you can go to the question of, what does the technology look like that supports that business? And, interestingly, I think almost regardless of how new the company is, there's going to be legacy technologies there. So even a company that's 20 years, 25 years old, like PayPal, like Google, like many others, it's been my experience that you can find legacy technologies. They may be a little bit different than in a 100-year-old company, but I think every company is in some place on that journey of refreshing technology and trying to stay modern. That's a little bit different than the business model point that I started with, and they're obviously related. But that's how we can double click on any of that, but that's how I tend to think about that question, Pedro.
I love that distinction between it's not about the technology stack, but about the business model, because you're right, the technology stack, like you said, you can have what you would consider digitally born companies that have a legacy stack, but it really is about the business model. But then it's interesting to think of a company like Netflix, for example, which you could argue is you would think of as a digitally born company, and yet they started out shipping out CDs, right? So, what are your thoughts on companies like that evolve their business model that way?
Yeah. So no, I think that's a great example of a company that started really focused on physical logistics. It was about inventory and warehouses and how long it took to ship. I think they used the U.S. Postal Service. There was a lot of optimization so that theoretically you could place an order today and have it in your mailbox tomorrow. A lot of that kind of focus, and yet then really pivoted to a complete digital model. I think you still can get physical DVDs and Blu-rays, but obviously it's a much different business model today. I think, interestingly, I'm not an expert on Netflix, but as I recall, they made that change way early and faced a lot of criticism that, at the time they started doing that, high-speed internet was not ubiquitous. So there was a lot of, and it was a big investment. So I think one of the lessons to me is that no matter where you started, are you looking for that disruption that is coming, that technology has enabled? And in the Netflix example, it really was the widespread availability of high-speed internet. Are you looking for that far enough into the future? And are you willing to face the innovator's dilemma to say, I'm willing to cannibalize some of my, or maybe a material part of my existing business in order to disrupt myself so that someone else doesn't come along and do it? I think that's one of the lessons, if that makes sense.
100%. And I think you're 100% right when you talk about, are you thinking of that disruption from very early on? I brought up Netflix. I was listening to a podcast recently where they were interviewing a former product leader at Netflix, and the gentleman was talking about how from the very beginning of the company, they were already thinking of streaming, even though streaming technology, would not go mainstream until, at least 10 years after that. So this touches on the point you made earlier that they were thinking about a very digital business model from the beginning, but yet the technology stack that existed didn't support that yet. So I think that's a really, really great distinction. And of course, Netflix is a great example, with what happened to companies like Blockbuster and what we saw in the book industry. Why do you think that digitally born companies are better positioned to succeed than some of their legacy competitors?
Yeah, so I think there is an advantage in thinking about that business model in a disruptive way from the beginning. And so a lot of these companies that we would term as being digitally native, were really created to disrupt. Their whole business model was to disrupt some legacy construct. And so I think there is an advantage in that, in that culturally, and culture is a big part of the competitive advantage of these companies. That culturally, I think there's a little bit more willingness to think outside the box, to think sort of future back, from thinking 10 or 15 or 20 years into the future, and think about what the world may look like, and then coming back and saying, how do we position ourselves for those different kinds of outcomes? That's not to say that legacy companies don't do that or can't, but I think that's it's hard to do, and particularly when you're faced with, are we willing to trade off our current business or some portion of it in order to have us be the disruptor and not someone else? It's easy to talk about that, but it's really, really hard to make those business decisions, potentially to suffer market reaction to those kind of things in the short run. So that's the challenge for every company.
And there's a lot of risk involved too. It's do you think it has? Do you think that challenge that you're talking about has more to do with the technology migration required, or is it more of a decision that we're going to have to completely alter our business model moving forward, and just move away from years or decades of doing things the way that we've been doing them?
Yeah, I think it's both. I personally think the business piece, the culture piece, sort of that paradigm is actually harder to change. That's not to take away from the challenges on the technology side. Most companies I know of, even relatively young ones, have this legacy, have aspects and pockets, in some cases very large pockets, of legacy technology. And the willingness to deal with that, and it can be a really expensive and disruptive proposition to change that out. But moving to a modern architecture of granular services with the smallest sort of single function components that then can be put together into platforms and ultimately customer facing products like that. If you don't have that, and if you're not investing to create that, I think your ability to compete at this exponential acceleration of change is going to be really limited. And so you have to have both. You have to have the business paradigm, the business model that is looking at where's the next disruption coming from, and are we going to do it to ourselves? And then secondly, are you creating the, I'll use the word infrastructure, that's again, gets used in a lot of different contexts, but have we created that tech stack that's going to enable accelerated change? And that's a modern, granular architecture. And then the third piece is really just from a product and a development standpoint. Do we have a modern, agile methodology, not just for writing code, but for how we think about customer needs, what that translates into in terms of product, the pipeline for that. Those are three pieces I think you got to have.
Yeah, and I want to touch on both sides of that, the business model piece and the tech stack piece. As a CIO, as a technology leader, an IT director within a company, how easy or difficult it is to assume that leadership role where you are actually influencing, shaping, or in even some cases actually directing that business strategy, right? Where it doesn't come from the CEO, but it comes from the technology side, from the CIO side, that we need to make this change to our business strategy.
Yeah. So, it depends on the culture of the company, but I'd say that in general, it is pretty hard. If you think about the way companies are organized and the leadership roles and the different functions, the role of the CIO, the CTO, that technology piece is actually relatively young. 50 plus years ago, it didn't exist in companies. So, and it started as a specialty function of we need people this stuff's complex. We don't understand it. We need people to focus on that. And now if you fast forward to today, we have an environment where for almost every company, technology is a key part of the strategy and that disruption that we talk about. So you have this role of the CIO or CTO moving from being a specialized sort of knowledge-based function to a business strategy role. And that's a hard transformation. And I think in a lot of legacy companies, CIOs that I know are still trying, in some cases, to have a seat at the table and looking for ways to bring business value. But that's an evolution that's taking place and accelerating for sure.
What would be your recommendations to CIOs or other IT leaders that want to have a bigger seat at the table and be able to influence business strategy that way?
Yeah, I think there's a number of things. One is the point we talked about, that finance is the language of business. So if you're a business leader, you need to be conversant in business strategy. You need to have a working knowledge of finance. You need to know how the company makes money and how it spends money. So that's one area. I think the second is to allocate enough time, because we all have packed schedules, but to allocate enough time to be thinking strategically and looking for those problems that exist. I like the term innovative problems. So are you looking for the innovative problem that might be hiding in plain sight that technology might be able to solve? Oftentimes we reverse that and talk about what's the innovative solution? What's the cool tech thing? I think that's a little cart before the horse. If you can identify innovative problems in the business and then bring solutions, that is a really direct way to start to have business impact. There's other things, but I think those two are really good starting points.
Yep, makes a lot of sense. Quick reminder for our audience today, we invite you to participate. Please send us your questions through the Q&A, send us your thoughts through the group chat. Both are activated, and you can find them through the toolbar at the bottom of your screen. Now, Brad, to talk about moving on to the tech stack side. So as an IT leader, as you embark on these digital transformation journeys, and understanding that there's no one-size-fits-all approach, typically, where do you start when you're looking at your tech stack?
Well, that's a really good question, Pedro. I like a lot of things, I think I'm going to default to it depends. Because I really think it does depend on the company's business model and where they are on this journey. So, at one end of the spectrum, companies that really have a long way to go in the transformation, you may start with some really fundamental things. You may start with agile development. You may start with some legacy layers in that tech stack that are vulnerable, not only from information security, but also just a stability and resiliency standpoint. If you're at the other end of the scale, where you're largely through a lot of those steps, then you may be looking at things like how do we move to more of a product and platform paradigm and away from projects and programs. I think a lot of companies today, they made the move to Agile some years ago. They've maybe made the move partially to the public cloud or private cloud, and there's some benefits in all of that. But many companies that I talk to are saying, well, that actually that's not enough. We actually are still not able to do change quick enough. We're not able to respond to the market, and so getting to a paradigm where we actually have product teams that are focused on the customer, what their pain points are, and doing journey mapping and grooming a prioritized backlog, and platform teams that are focused on those capabilities that stretch across the company, whose customers are the product teams like that. That whole paradigm, I think there's quite a few companies today trying to crack the code on that and figure out. And at the end of the day, it's about velocity of change and frequency of change. Because the one thing that is clear is that the pace of change continues to grow exponentially in terms of customer expectations. Certainly this year, we've all seen things happen in days or weeks that would have taken, in some cases, years previously with the way that we thought about it. So those are some of the thoughts I have about that.
And I really like your thoughts on thinking and operating like a product team or like a product manager or a product owner, in the sense that, at least I found in my experience, very, very, very solid, successful, capable IT organizations do sort of have that mindset of we're product owners or we're a product team, and they talk about customer journeys and they talk about backlogs and that sort of things. Is that what you've seen too?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's difficult. I think that's a harder transformation than some of the tech stuff. And certainly from a talent or for talent standpoint, finding that, different companies call it different things, but that product owner role, finding the right skill set, which is a mix of product skills and appreciation for technology and how things get created. That's a really unique mix of skills and hard to find. I think it's sometimes harder to find than the war for talent around a particular development skill set. But I think the payoff is huge, and certainly when we talk about digital native companies, those that are pretty adept at it, you don't have to look far to see their ability to create new products, to change existing products, and and the velocity of that compared to others that, may still be locked into, hey, we do 3 big releases a year or whatever. That it used to be there were industries where that maybe was okay. I think there are fewer and fewer today where that's okay, and perhaps not, where, the old way of doing it works anymore.
And to continue on the theme of digital acceleration, Brad, and digital transformation, our Looker is a data and analytics product. In your experience, where does data and analytics fall within that digital transformation? At what point do you look at those investments as you're going down that journey?
Yeah. I think it's a little analogous to what we just talked about in that there was a time when for a lot of companies data was sort of interesting, but not necessarily a key part of the strategy. I think there are fewer and fewer companies today where data is not front and center due to business strategy, and in fact, a lot of times is one of the key drivers of disruption. So whether it is analytic insights, whether it's AI and machine learning, whether it's direct monetization, like there's just different and increasingly deep value pools being created in different industries and different companies around data. And I think there's waves of this. Everything in technology has a hype cycle where it's and then there's disillusionment, and then it actually starts to actually drive value and disruption. And I think when it comes to data, we've come through a lot of those waves and are now, not that it's necessarily mature, but as I said, for most every company that I know is trying to figure out how do we not only leverage the data we have, how can it drive disruption, how can it drive business insights, how can it drive AI? It is increasingly the key value proposition for more and more companies.
How do we monetize it too?
Yeah, I mean and how do we monetize it while adhering to an increasingly tall bar around privacy and security? Those seem like opposite goals, but I think there are ways to accomplish both. But yeah, it's an interesting world, and that's an area where if we look 5 or 10 years out and said, what will the world look like? I think you have a really interesting conversation about that.
Well, 100%. I've gone through that now a few times in my career where I've been in data and analytics my entire career, and there's been at least 2 or 3 moments where I feel, okay, this is it. This is as much as this industry is going to do. And then a few years later, it's just something that I just did not expect. So you're completely right. And it's very consistent with what we see. You mentioned this focus on data and analytics. Gartner comes up with this survey every year about CIO priorities. I forget what it's called. It's the CIO Outlook. It has a name every year. They run it, and consistently, at least for the last 10 years, the number one investment priorities for technology leaders is data and analytics. You mentioned you talk about the opportunities that can emerge from those investments. It's more than just the insights the data give you. Really, it's something that you can use I believe, as a real asset to grow the business, to uncover new opportunities, to, when we talk about monetization, generate new revenue streams. So I think that's really important.
Now, most companies I know are drowning in data, but they're starving for insight. And figuring out how to crack that code in a way that preserves privacy and security, that is a target-rich environment, I guess.
It is. It completely is. We've got a couple of questions from the audience, Brad. I'll take the easy one and I'll give you the hard one.
All
So
right.
they're both from Michael. So the easy one is what team and player is Pedro's soccer jersey on the wall? That is my favorite team from the Mexican Soccer League, Chivas Guadalajara. That jersey is signed by the 2006 championship team. So very very proud of that possession in my office. So that's the easy one. The hard one, Brad, is do you have any suggestions on how to balance building new product features while
Yeah.
working at product support at the same time? And is one more important than the other to you?
Yeah, it's a great question, Michael, that asked that. Um, so, I can think of examples of companies where, the focus seems to be all on the new shiny stuff and, delivering things that, maybe don't always work the way we want and sometimes are broken. And that obviously is not a good path. That doesn't end well. And so there has to be a balance there between the new stuff and making sure that the things actually, I'd put it this way, making sure the new stuff actually works and doesn't create more, customer pain points is not broken for 10% of the customers. And secondly, then that we do support what we've created 2 or 3 years ago. Or we make the hard decision and the painful one sometimes to depreciate it, to actually shut it down. That's a painful, but oftentimes necessary decision. So I don't think there's a silver bullet here. I think you can look at, and I think it varies by industry and company, what percent should be into new features versus supporting old. I think there's a similar question around, how much should we spend on new versus run the engine or, refreshing legacy technologies. And again, I think that those proportions probably vary by industry and company. But the first step is, are you measuring it? And so do you actually know what the numbers are? We spend X% on the new stuff and we spend Y% on maintaining. It's interesting. I think a lot of companies don't really have that data. Speaking to the data again, you could guess, but sometimes the data will tell you something different than your guess. I like to think about another way to look at it is that, to me, there's a foundational layer around things like security, things like resiliency, and as a technology leader, if the capabilities we're creating are not, if they're down, if they're not secure, we don't even really get the opportunity to work on the cool, shiny stuff. So you've got to make sure that what you're creating is, from an availability standpoint and security standpoint, where it needs to be. And then you earn the right to work on the cool stuff. I also think that where companies are in their life cycle will vary how much of because we all have limited resources, so what percent of your pie is spent on each of those. So that's the way I like to think about that question.
Yeah, the innovator's dilemma for sure. And you're right, Brad, it does have a lot to do with the stage of the company you're in. Very, very early, more mature, now completely established. But that never goes away. And do I invest in the things that my customers are asking me for right now, these very, very specific product issues, or and how much do I invest in things that I think the market is going to be asking for in some time that are more forward-looking? Great question for sure. I want to talk a little bit about the past year, Brad, and obviously, the enormous disruption that we've all experienced, certainly from a personal perspective, but specifically from a business and technology perspective. We've seen a massive acceleration in the move to digital over the past year. Just years of IT acceleration compressed into months right? As companies really really revamped their product offerings, their service offerings, their technology stacks, their business models in an effort to just try to navigate through the pandemic. But my question is, do you expect that this acceleration that we've seen has somewhat closed the gap between digitally born companies and the legacy companies?
Yeah. So that's a great question, Pedro. I don't have, this is just my opinion. I think this may be a case where you'd like to think that it closed the gap, but I think the reality is, the expectations have gone up at a rate that's, equal to or perhaps greater than the acceleration of the capabilities. So I'm not sure that we've actually closed the gap. I think what's happened is expectations have changed, and maybe the gap's bigger now. I don't know. I also think it's related to your question that, I think this year is a great illustration of what I like to call the power of focus, meaning that, when I talk to companies this year about what they've done around work from home, and even in some environments like, customer contact center kinds of environments where this idea of working from home is actually not new. It's been around for a long time, but there are certain jobs that, were just really hard to do that way, or that there was viewed as regulatory issues. You can't do financial services, customer service in a work at home environment. Well, guess what? This year, every company that I've talked to made that switch in a matter of days, and if not a week kind of time frame. And previously, if we had said, yeah, we need to get this done, that would have been like a multi-year journey. Well, we need to pilot, we need to check this, then. Well, why is that? Well, because one, there was no choice. And secondly, it was just all hands on deck. We got to get this done this week. And so, when I think about my career, I've seen a handful of examples where you had that kind of focus, where everybody was just, we got to get this done because there is no choice. And it is amazing what can be accomplished when you get everyone focused on something. So, my challenge would be to think about, it doesn't take shouldn't have to take a crisis to harness the power of focus. Yet I think many companies struggle with that. They have many things going on, and it moves slowly. Whereas, if you're an adherent to lean manufacturing or lean development, you would say that if I focus on one thing, I can actually get that done and move on to the next thing quicker than trying to do 10 at once and multitasking. So a little bit different than what you asked, but it's related.
It is very much. It's a lot of it is human nature, right? It's having the will to do it, but also being pushed by the urgency to do it. I've had the opportunity to host a couple of roundtables in the past month where you see that theme that you just mentioned come up a lot. These companies that talk about some really fascinating, very, very innovative changes that they made to their business model. I'll give you a couple of examples. And they willingly admit these would not have happened if the pandemic had not happened. One, for example, is an insurance company. They'll send appraisers to your house when you're going to sell it, and they'll do the visual inspection. And of course, because of the pandemic and social distancing restrictions and all of that, they weren't able to do that anymore. So now they've adopted drone technology. They send out the drones to take these pictures, right? And there's all these really interesting possibilities of where that could even go further, where you can use image recognition to analyze the images that the drone is taking. Anyway, and there's another example of a retail company. Well, it's actually a software company that supports retailers. And when all these stores had to shut down because of the pandemic, because you couldn't have people physically inside a store, this software company very, very quickly pivoted their data and analytics technology to turn those stores into distribution centers. So now all these retailers very quickly shifted to online, to e-commerce, and they were able to very intelligently manage their inventory based on their locations, based on where the buyers were located. And the fact that it was done in such a remarkably short amount of time, that it was such an important change, and that it's been so successful, really touches on what you were saying, Brad. It's interesting that it took a pandemic to make these things happen that are so valuable and are going to stay. They're not going to go away when the pandemic goes away. They're just now the new business model.
Yeah, no, exactly. And I think, those are illustrations, I think, of what we were talking about before around what are the innovative problems? So the insurance example you gave, Pedro, one that, I think as you look at that problem of, hey, we have to send a person to climb up on a roof on a ladder to see if there was hail damage or whatever that was a problem before the pandemic. It's unsafe, it's expensive. And yet, sort of that problem is hiding in plain sight. And, it's just kind of how we always did things. And so this idea of why does it take a crisis to shine light on these problems? Because problems, in many cases, were there before. And the technology existed in many cases before. So it is an interesting human nature kind of thing that these problems the unknown problems that are hiding in plain sight oftentimes turn out to be the things that are actually have the potential to be disruptive and add the most value.
They are without a doubt. So, we hear a lot about the, as we are, at least in this country, very encouraging signs that, we're seeing that light at the end of the tunnel now in terms of the pandemic, more people getting vaccinated and we're sort of now getting the feeling that we're getting closer back to normal. But we also hear this phrase, the new normal, right? And we're talking about it in terms of business models that have changed, customer experiences that have been reimagined. What is your recommendation to organizations, digitally born or not, to best position themselves for whatever this new normal is?
Yeah. I think that it's that idea. One idea is thinking about that. What does the future look like? What are the different scenarios? And then backing from that. And I think we have it may also be human nature that we tend to think in binary kind of like, we're totally locked down or we're totally back to the way it was. I think it's likely the real future is going to be much more nuanced than that. And so I think for companies to think about that complexity and not get sucked into the idea of, well, it's going to go back to the way it was. I think I was looking at some data today actually on the work from home, on surveys around work from home, and it was I think this was in the US, something like 2/3 of those surveyed actually, don't want to, they want to continue to work from home, be it full-time or perhaps in a hybrid model. So why is that? If you imagined a world where, it's debatable if we're going to be in that world where we have less concerns about the coronavirus, but if you just assume that was the case, why would people not want to? Well, the problem is commute time and expense, and maybe I like the flexibility. Maybe I have childcare concerns. Maybe there's all kinds of aspects to that problem. So I don't know. I don't have. I wish I had a crystal ball, but one thing I'm fairly certain about is that it's going to be more nuanced and complex than we would like to think it would be.
It will. We're experiencing that at Google ourselves, talking about this new normal and what return to the office looks like. There were a couple of pieces in the New York Times. I think the Today Show did a feature on Google too, and just reimagining the future of work. and how do you maintain that productivity and that engagement and that interaction when you are going to have people that prefer to work remotely, permanently, full time or maybe part time. And to your earlier point, I think that out of this sort of disruption that forced a new way of thinking about going back to work, I do think that good things will emerge. So I'll invite the audience one last time to send any other questions or comments that you have for Brad or myself. And I'm going to ask you one last question, Brad, and before we wrap up, or ask any other or answer any other questions that come in through the chat or the Q&A. There will be another disruption. We don't know what that will be. We could, I think, reasonably suggest that the world was caught unprepared for this one in many respects. From a business and technology perspective, what do digital natives need to do to be prepared for whenever that next disruption comes?
Yeah. Boy, I wish I had a crystal ball. Hindsight's 20/20, isn't it? That, if you go back and look, there's actually of many people, experts and others who, years 2, 3, 4, 5, 10 years ago said, this is coming. What we just experienced is coming. And some are remarkably close to what actually did happen. And yet we were caught by surprise. So I think one is many times there are people out there who are talking about issues that seem far away, that are maybe not. So it's back to that scenario planning and thinking about far out in the future, and making sure some of those scenarios are out of the box, kind of things. That's one. And then I think another is that like expectations and the pace of technology change is exponential. I think we're in a period where volatility is also increasing. So just the whether it's financial markets or healthcare and epidemic, we're seeing these events that we're supposed to be once, or weather events that were supposed to be once every 100 years, happening a lot more frequent, seemingly a lot more frequently than that. So this volatility and these, some would call them black swan events that seem to be happening pretty frequently, I think is another reason to do that scenario planning with some real out of the box thinking, and just the exercise of doing that. And starting to plan for how you'd react as a company if faced with that has a lot of benefits, even if that exact scenario doesn't happen. As I think about it, a year ago or just over a year ago, all the things that I was certain were going to happen didn't, and the things that I was certain wouldn't happen did. And so our ability to predict that seems, maybe it's just me, but I thought the housing market was going to crash. The exact opposite happened. And you could just go down. Who would have thought we would have a chip shortage, or you couldn't find a home or a car? Like, it just, so if that's the world we're in, then I think this divergent scenario planning is really important to help you chart a strategy.
Right there with you with the housing market, Brad. It's really interesting. So before we get into Q&A, we have one more question that came in, Brad, before wrapping up. Any closing thoughts from your side?
No. I think again, I really appreciate the opportunity to chat. I guess my closing thought would be search for the innovative problems, because they quite often might be the source of disruption in your industry.
Excellent. Well, Brad, thank you so much for your time and for your insights today. Just a really, really great conversation. We do have one question that came in just before we wrap up from Michael. Thank you, Michael. Okay. The question is, what metrics would you look for to consider that the return to work in offices in whatever form it takes as being successful? Are you looking at performance by your development team, survey of employees, other? What thoughts do you have there?
Yeah, it's a great question. Productivity, especially in knowledge workers or specifically in software development, is like notoriously hard to measure. And every metric out there has, unintended consequences. So I think that the approach, could be one where you look at a number of different things. So, clearly, employee sentiment surveys, turnover, those kind of things can be maybe somewhat lagging indicators, but important indicators. And then I think to the extent that you can measure productivity or collaboration, again, really hard to measure, but those can be helpful. I think that, doing there's some interesting analytical research around how people communicate and the networks they form with inside companies. And you can actually map that out based on meetings and emails and other things and draw a network diagram and identify people who are actually key in knowledge repositories or thought leaders. And it might be completely independent of their position in the company. But so there can be interesting insight there. But I think it's a holistic approach. I also think there's probably some interesting technology opportunities for replicating things that used to happen in person that don't have good analogies yet in the virtual environment, like meeting people at the coffee station or the water cooler or whatever in the hallway and having a quick 2-minute conversation that actually leads you to solve a problem or find a solution. Those don't have great analogies in the virtual world yet, but I think they will. So, looking for all those experiences that we get in the physical environment and saying, do we have good alternatives in the virtual world? I think is, and even just like this conference, the technology to be able to do this stuff, it wasn't that ubiquitous just a couple of years ago, and it's really advanced a lot this year. So those would be a few things that I'd think about.
That's a great perspective, Brad. I like your thought of things that we can't necessarily measure today because we don't have that analogy in the virtual world, but we will. For sure we will. We are going to see things in the next 3, 4, 5 years that we're not even thinking of right now. So that's great. Well, again, just once again, Brad, thank you so much for your time and your perspective. It was enormously enlightening for me, and I'm sure for the audience as well. And on behalf of Brad and myself, thank you so much. To everybody who joined us today, thank you for your questions and your comments. And as I said, we will be sending a recording of this session after the event. So thank you for joining us, and have a great day.
Thank you.